All right. I almost forgot to hit record, so I'm glad I remembered that real quick. But thank you for being here. We're very excited, and it is my pleasure to introduce our board member and one of our leading Fitzgerald scholars, Dr. Margaret Daniel. And Margaret is best known as the editor of this great collection, I Die for You and Other Lost Stories, that came out, 4 years ago now. It's hard to believe. I would just mention to all of you emerging scholars out there, I am still waiting for submissions to the Fitzgerald Review on many of these new stories that are in Anne Margaret's collection. And I know she'd be happy to help you out on any questions you might have about that. Anne Margaret comes to us with a PhD from Princeton and a JD from the University of Virginia. She's also wonderfully active on social media, does a lot of blog writing, the latest of which is a great article about a lost Fitzgerald painting. But I would also call your attention to a LitHub article she did a couple years ago about a planned Fitzgerald novel that she discovered in the archive there at Princeton. So without further ado, I want to say thank you, Anne Margaret, for taking this task on. And I look forward, thank you for our Michael and Arnold for being here. And I am going to leave us.
Well, thank you very much for that generous introduction, Kirk, and welcome everyone today. I'm going to make my comments brief because you guys are here to hear Arnold and Michael, not to hear me, in our first of two panels on F. Scott Fitzgerald and race. This one being entitled Postwar New York, that is to say post-World War I, and quote, the rising tide of color. That quotation, The Rising Tide of Color, is the title of a book by one Lothrop Stoddard, published in 1920 by Fitzgerald's own publisher, Charles Scribner's Sons. Welcoming today, Arnold Rampersad, who I have known since my graduate days at Princeton. Arnold is the Kimball Professor in the Humanities Emeritus at Stanford University. He has taught at Rutgers, Columbia, and Princeton, and is internationally known as one of the leading literary biographers writing today. Arnold is the co-author of Days of Grace, a memoir with Arthur Ashe, and he is the author of Jackie Robinson, a biography, The Life of Langston Hughes, Ralph Ellison's biography, The Art and Imagination of W.E.B. Du Bois, among many other books and editions. A MacArthur Foundation Fellow from 1991 to 96, Rampersad received the National Humanities Medal in 2010. He's joined today by Dr. Michael Nowlin. Michael is a board member of our Fitzgerald Society and professor of English and chair of the department at the University of Victoria in Canada. He is the author of F. Scott Fitzgerald's Racial Angles and the Business of Literary Greatness. He is the editor of the Broadview edition of The Great Gatsby, and also of the forthcoming Richard Wright in Context, as well as the Cambridge Companion to F. Scott Fitzgerald. Welcome to both of you today, scholars and gentlemen. And we'd like to start today with a few comments from Professor Rampersad. So Arnold, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Margaret. I'm really honored to be asked to join you and Mike Nowlin to take part in this discussion of Scott Fitzgerald and especially The Great Gatsby in relationship to the Harlem Renaissance and the writing it inspired, as well as the Great Depression, although I don't say much about that. I suspect that much of what I say, some certainly will echo Michael's previous distinguished public writing on the general subject, but there's surely no harm in repeating them now and then. Why explore this link between a now canonical white writer and the much lesser known artists of the Harlem Renaissance? I would say we should do so because all are or were cut from the same fabric, American culture and history in a particular time, at a particular time, certain decade or 2 decades. To be sure, Fitzgerald's perspective on the age, the 1920s and 30s before the Depression touched bottom, starting with what he called cleverly and to some extent prophetically, Fitzgerald did, the Jazz Age, or as we would say provincially, the Harlem Renaissance, was obviously not that of exactly that of the major Black writers of the decade. Nevertheless, this fact does not lessen the connection that I see certainly between his fundamental effort in writing Gatsby and their own different individual approaches and literary performances. I can't stress enough my belief, both as an accomplished work of literature, that Gatsby, both as an accomplished work of literature and as a politically disruptive, even radical work. Personally, I believe that Gatsby, the novel, is a bona fide product and representative of the age, as well as probably the single most subtle and accomplished work of art with authentic ties to the spirit that inspired the Harlem Renaissance. To be brief and I hope direct, I see The Great Gatsby as centered in a direct critique, no news here, and even radical indictment of the dominant forces of American culture, not only in the Eastern USA, especially in New York City, the putative site of the Harlem Renaissance, but also the United States as a whole, from the present of 1925 when the book appeared to the, and you know these lines so well, the old island here that flowered once for Dutch sailors' eyes, a fresh green breast of the world. This new untouched land, quote, had once pandered in whispers to the last and greatest of all human dreams. Man must have held his breath in the presence of this continent, compelled into an aesthetic contemplation he neither understood nor desired, face to face for the last time in history with something commensurate to his capacity for wonder. The way I read Gatsby, and have read for a long time, the novel, sees it as perhaps the most subversive fictional document challenging the dominant white, wealth-obsessed, and racially twisted American culture since, please don't laugh if you think it too far-fetched, Melville's Benita Cereno, and before that novella, Moby Dick. I look at the literature published between those Melville books and Fitzgerald's masterpiece and do not see a more profound and also artful challenge to the Republic in all its works and pomps, to use words usually attached, I know, to the devil, and than The Great Gatsby. I should stop right here and say the obvious, that Fitzgerald had no interest in writing a tract against racism or against the web of intellectual racist theory that scorned the so-called Negro. Here was an element of probably deliberate distancing that was at least twofold in nature. First, Fitzgerald had to be faithful to the intellectual and moral range of his narrator, Nick Carraway, much as Mark Twain, had to respect Huck's own limited range. Secondly, he had to keep in mind, Fitzgerald did, the discipline and the goal of fine fictional art, which correctly, I think, finds propaganda to be distasteful. Fitzgerald was aided by the fact that his novel almost involuntarily challenged not only American racism, that prime element in the American past, if you take into account slavery and the Civil War and so on, but also the capitalistic excess that marred the American dream, that corrupted it. In this novel, if not in his own life, Fitzgerald presents an America that is profoundly and irrevocably compromised on this score. Gatsby clings desperately to his dream, quote from the novel, but he did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under the night. Progress is, in crucial respects, a gross illusion. So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. I think it's important to stress that Fitzgerald was hardly alone among the writers of the age haunted by the horrors of the American past, that he and the Great Gatsby were part of a movement that inspired its creation, that shaped it. His book should thus be seen in the necessary context of books such as W.B. Du Bois's Darkwater, Voices from Within the Veil, 1920, Jean Toomer's Cain, 1923, Jessie Fawcett's novel There Is Confusion, and Nella Larson's Quicksand, Langston Hughes's landmark book of poems, The Weary Blues, 1926, where the title poem appeared first in 1925, and the blues saturated Fine Clothes to the Jew, 1927, also by Langston Hughes, and also Claude McKay's Home to Harlem, 1928. These are among others, to be sure. The Great Gatsby also challenges, if apparently in casual passing, those major works that constituted the first wave in the 20th century of what is now being derided as critical race theory by the American right, the latest boogeyman corrupting the nation, allegedly. Building on earlier theorists, such as the Count de Gobineau, was Madison Grant's The Passing of the Great Race, 1916, which appeared on the heels of the historic film Birth of a Nation in 1915, which also did similar work of a different kind perhaps, but similar. Also crucial about this time was the publication in the US of an abbreviated translation of Gobineau's seminal essay on the inequality of human races, and also the appearance of Houston Stewart Chamberlain's Foundations of the 19th Century. And of course, as has been mentioned, as Margaret has mentioned, Lothrop Stoddard's The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, which is the rest of the title, The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy, 1920, and The Revolt Against Civilization, The Menace of the Underman, 1923. Obviously, Fitzgerald choked on Stoddard, so much so that he permitted him entry, thinly disguised, into his fictional procession in Gatsby. In the 1920s, the most powerful force in resisting and transmuting white racism was music, notably the blues, I would say, more so even than literature. The Harlem Renaissance writers did not take on directly intellectual giants such as Gobineau and Madison Grant. Even someone as well-trained at Harvard and Berlin as Du Bois hesitated to butt heads with individuals accepted as almost transcendent intellectual authorities in fields such as eugenics or the glories of Teutonic civilization, where one did not challenge the gods lightly. But the artists of color and their white allies challenged error and slander in their own way. So to me, there is no talking about this subject of Gatsby at length without looking at the work of poets such as Vachel Lindsay, The Congo, 1914, and Carl Sandburg, who inspired Langston Hughes, who called him my guiding star, with his Chicago poems of 1916 and Spoken Steel of 1920, with the latter including the influential poem Jazz Fantasia. Or the playwright Eugene O'Neill's The Emperor Jones of 1920 and All God's Children Got Wings, 1924, before he went on to, one might say, greater things. Nor should we dare to forget the first blues recording, Mamie Smith's Crazy Blues in 1923, which quickly sold 75,000 copies to Blacks and whites alike, and in a sense sent us on our way, our slow but steady way towards the kind of music that we accept now as American music, reflecting American reality. Or the sensationally successful all-Black musical Shuffle Along on Broadway in 1920. And also the occasion I always think of when in The Great Gatsby, we hear that, quote, at the request of Mr. Gatsby, the orchestra would play Vladimir Tostow's Jazz History of the World, quote, which attracted so much attention at its Carnegie Hall debut last May. The reference being, I would think, to the first performance at Aeolian Hall in Manhattan on February 12, 1924, of George Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, conducted by Paul Whiteman and with Gershwin at the piano. The new prestige of jazz was such that the packed audience included Igor Stravinsky, Leopold Stokowski, John Philip Sousa, Victor Herbert, and Walter Damrosch, the conductor, as well as Willie the Lion Smith. Out of this melange, I would say, came in one form or another, The Great Gatsby as a supreme American fictional meditation on a historically changing world. It is the essence of dynamism. It is the essence, to me, of critical theory, in a way, turned into delectable fiction, into brilliant, persuasive, obsessionally so fiction, a fiction that will last and will stand, I think, for a long time, perhaps forever, as such things go, of the ability of the artist, the literary artist, to concoct, to create a narrative that is at once at various levels seductive and entertaining and so on, but also profoundly deep and challenging the so-called truths of a culture and pointing to other truths which in hindsight we see as more important finally. So that's my little introduction.
Thank you so much. That was elegant and good heavens, all pervasive and challenging and engaging. Thank you. Now let's turn to Michael Nowlin. Thank you very much, Michael.
Great. Thank you, Anne, Margaret, and thank you, Arnold. Thanks for a wonderful talk. I'll just sort of say where I clearly agree with you, again, that Fitzgerald was certainly not writing a tract. I think this is, and again, so is it a tract against racism? I think you've made one of the strongest arguments I've ever heard that it's actually a kind of subversive text, or challenging America's racist history. It's and of course the power of money. There's also arguments out there, of course, that it's in fact defending racism, that in fact it's a kind of white supremacist text in disguise, and I certainly don't accept that argument, but I would certainly see the text as much more ambiguous than you're seeing. And of course, this is a source of a great deal of its power, and the fact that we're still kind of arguing about this again. To simplify the other vision, we have a sort of satire directed at Tom Buchanan, who's clearly a dolt, and he's making this argument. Have you read this new book, The Rise of the Colored Empire? He's clearly meant to be seen as a buffoon. And in a strange way, though, the novel seems to confirm that there is a rising tide of color out there that seems to be threatening the status quo. And where Fitzgerald stands in relation to that, it seems to me it's a bit more ambiguous. I would argue it's a bit more ambiguous than where you're coming from. I also certainly agree that one of the most fruitful ways to approach this subject is to think about, read Fitzgerald in relation to the Harlem Renaissance and to other writing going on around there. And I think that's one of the things I'm trying to help students do when this new edition of the second edition of The Great Gatsby comes out, not only in relation to a work like The New Negro, which came out in 1925, at least in its book form, as opposed to the survey graphic version of it in 1924. But I also I actually include in the volume a good section from Alain Locke's opening essay, The New Negro, and a section from Joel Rogers on jazz that's in there. I also include a chapter from Anja Jezierska, the Jewish American novelist. Her novel Bread Givers came out in that year, and it's what we'd call an American dream story. I mean, this is, and I was struck by that. I'm always struck by that line in The Great Gatsby where Nick says, "I could imagine Gatsby coming from the Lower East Side or the swamps of Louisiana," and I don't quite. The association of Gatsby of being from the Lower East Side, of course, would there's an association there. He's like one of these Jewish immigrants who has suddenly risen to a position of power or fame or whatever. I don't quite get the swamps of Louisiana. I don't know if that's supposed to be like white trash or something, or somebody, who knows. But again, Gatsby is never identified as Black or Jewish or anything, but there's something suspect about it. And the unknown gets racialized throughout, and there's a kind of association throughout. So I think we do have to read this novel in relation to these other things. I tend to approach Fitzgerald in my book, which was written quite a while ago. I was kind of looking at some of the argument again, but one of the things I emphasize is Fitzgerald's identification with the outsider. Where would the possibility of someone like Fitzgerald launching such a critique as Dr. Rampersad is suggesting come from? And it comes from this sense of being an outsider and being internally divided. And one of the things I found for my book, and this was one of a couple of similar kind of items, is this postcard from 1917. It's a minstrel drawing, really. Like Fitzgerald drew this on a postcard. And interesting, trademark is the word that he writes across that. His trademark is a kind of minstrel figure version of himself. And he sent similar postcards to, and he was sending it to young women who he was trying to impress. And one of them, he has a similar kind of minstrel figure and then a little caricature of himself as a white college student. And he says, do I look like this or like this? And I make a lot of that, maybe too much in my book, that this is, again, the Black becomes a source of figuring division, both, psychic division, kind of the divisions. I talk about the Black face of Fitzgerald's ambition to be an entertainer, to be a movie star, to be a great popular writer, and his ambivalence about that, because he also had this notion of literature as this high art. So I see that as a source of the Nick's ambivalence about Gatsby, because Gatsby is the quintessential outsider. And in some of the earlier stories, we sometimes refer to these stories as Gatsby cluster stories or early avatars of the Gatsby figure. You see the association with the African-American very clearly. Two stories that really stand out: The Offshore Pirate from 1920, where it's actually a rich boy who's stooping to conquer, so to speak, by pretending to be a poor boy who has hooked himself up with an African-American jazz band, and all of this to seduce this young, beautiful woman. And the other story that's important, I think, is there's several, but the most important, Dice, Brass Knuckles, and Guitar from 1923. And there we get this poor Southern boy who comes north to sell himself as a jazz master. And he's got this African-American servant, kind of almost symbiotically attached. They're driving this old jalopy. I think its name's Hugo or something like that. But clearly the knowledge that he has to sell is very much inseparable from his connection to this African-American servant who's virtually voiceless, but also participates in the teaching. And it's in that story that the woman who I can't remember if he gets the girl or not at the end, but she at least says to him at the end, you're worth the whole damn bunch of them, or whatever. It's the line that he will later lift, and Nick will use that to kind of bless Gatsby vis-a-vis the rest of them. So this is where I think Fitzgerald, there's a kind of identification going on there with the African-American. But I just say he's working out his own ambivalence. And I'm not sure he ever transcends that. And maybe this would speak to the issue of his connection to the Harlem Renaissance. So from what I see, I can see all kinds of ways you could read the novels together, Harlem Renaissance novels and Fitzgerald novels and some of the poetry. But from what I gather, Fitzgerald really had no knowledge of this, which is quite shocking, given that he really kept up with contemporary writing. And this is what I'm talking about in a current essay I'm writing for the Companion. I cannot find that he read any of the Harlem Renaissance novels apart from Carl Van Vechten's sort of notorious popular 1926 novel. And he did write a letter to him. And I think I don't think I'll read that letter here, but it would disturb us somewhat. I mean, he uses racist language, which again, this is a kind of reflexive racism that was so commonplace. And actually Van Vechten did not tend to use that kind of language, except in the title of his book. But he tends to see it in a fairly simplistic form. But another striking thing is he actually read in 1923, The Messenger, and he wrote a letter to A. Philip Randolph and said, I read The Messenger from cover to cover. This was, of course, an African-American magazine, sort of socialist. I believe Randolph was a socialist. So he did read this and he wrote him this courteous letter. But again, I haven't seen that he read much more. And there is a reference to, he wrote a letter to one of the editors at Bonnie and Leverett, or Liveright, I'm not sure how to pronounce that. And he said, I'm looking forward to getting the Kuhn volume. And I'm assuming, given that there's no date on this, but it's placed as 22 to 24. This would be Cain, I would think. This would be Jane Toomer's Cain. And so on the one hand, he refers to it in an offensive way, but he also says, I look forward to reading it. But again, I've never seen any testimony to what he thought reading it, because he leaves a lot of testimony in his letters. So there's a real blind spot there, it seems to me, which is quite striking. And if there's a reference to the Harlem Renaissance in the novel, it's of course, it comes through that somewhat caricatured reference of those African Americans coming across the bridge. They're well off, maybe they're jazz musicians. I don't know. They seem to be going toward Harlem, but they're caricatured. But Nick says, of course, anything can happen. Looking at them, anything can happen. Even Gatsby can happen. So there's that connection, the association of Gatsby with the rise of these people, because Gatsby's a novel about the limits of social mobility. Gatsby has risen as far as he can, and he's crushed. He's exposed as an imposter, and he's destroyed. But there's glimpses throughout the novel of other people rising, including these African Americans who seem to sort of metonomically represent the Harlem Renaissance. And there are references to jazz tunes. There's references to the Blue Street, the Beale Street Blues, etc. So it's quite complicated. On the one hand, he cannot. I certainly agree with Dr. Rampersad's point. He cannot not see this, insofar as he's writing a novel about the modern American scene in 1925, which he wants to be the great American novel. But there are those blind spots, and the blind spots come across through that element of caricature. There's a kind of, he's seeing and refusing to see at the same time. And there's stories connected to all these people, the little Italian kids playing with firecrackers on the 4th of July. There's stories there that simply get reduced to these images. And they're all images that would seem to confirm in some ways Tom Buchanan's vision. So certainly Tom does not come out well, and Gatsby is the romantic hero. But in elegizing Gatsby the way he does, there's a kind of goodbye to the American dream, but that goodbye is kind of undercut in the novel by these new arrivals. So maybe I'll leave it at that and see what kind of questions people have to ask. But
I would just say, if I could make an interjection, that it's quite possible to dislike Black people and white people at the same time. And also, I'm talking about the possibilities of Fitzgerald's attitude to basic attitudes on the racial question. But to train your biggest guns, as it were, on white people, because they are the immensely more powerful. They are the purveyor of the core lies, if you see it that way, about the function, the purpose of the Republic, and so on. And that's where I think, I agree completely that Fitzgerald in The Great Gatsby is no great lover of Blacks, but I think that he is powerfully bent on undermining the idea of white authority, white supremacy.
I agree with
when I used to teach the book, I don't anymore, nobody wants me to, but I'd point out how in The Great Gatsby, the word white comes up at least 40 times. And I said, what is the purpose of all of this? And I think that one of it is to show America as a whited sepulcher, and he is going that's one of his major tasks, to expose it as such before he leaves it in horror and flees to the Midwest.
And the color white is so intimately associated with Daisy, who is so flawed in so many ways. Michael, that mention of the Beale Street Blues is attached to a scene in which Daisy was a girl dancing at home in Louisville. Which is also has a certain power to it.
I don't know much about music, really, though I have read some good essays on that. And I think there's a fellow who obviously knows much more about it than I do, had said that, again, his reference to the Beale Street Blues is, on the one hand, it's telling. This is the soundtrack of their lives, so to speak. but he does refer to it in a fairly dismissive way. And again, he refers to jazz in such a way as to suggest this is purely pessimistic. I can't remember the exact phrasing he uses, but he's missing, again, some of the complexity of the blues. Of course, it's been described by many, many people for a century at least. But so there again, he can't not see it, note it, make it part of this world. And again, you're absolutely right, Arnold, that it's Daisy and certainly Tom. They're the villains of this novel, and certainly Tom Buchanan and everything they stand for. But there's a certain irony in the fact that there's this Black soundtrack to their life, or there's this Jewish Black American soundtrack, this immigrant soundtrack that has picked up on the sounds of African American music and adopted it for their own, see, as American music. It just can't not be there in this novel, right? So.
Got a couple of questions coming in now, and I encourage anyone listening to send in their questions either through the chat screen or the Q&A, and I will fish them out and forward them to our panelists today. A question for you, Arnold, from Chalmers, who says, quote, "The evidence is very strong that Fitzgerald was racist through at least 1935. I'm not hearing him challenging the existing republic." Would both of you like to address that?
I didn't quite get the question.
The question, or rather the statement, is from Chalmers, who says that the evidence is very strong that Fitzgerald was racist through at least 1935. How exactly is he challenging the existing republic?
Well, I mean, to me, if you read The Great Gatsby, you see it as a requiem for a dead dream. I mean, I think that's the way Nick presents it as he narrates it. It's there's nothing in it that suggests that this so-called noble experiment worked or did anything other than come and fall apart for various reasons. I don't think I agree that those people who say, well, Fitzgerald is the portrait picture of blacks is not a very happy one. Yeah, but right away you were aware of slavery, and I think that the narrator is taking that into account all the time, and that slavery has been replaced by more modern forms of human exploitation, manipulation of values. So, well, that's the way I see it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Michael, anything to add to that?
I pretty much agree. I mean, I'm a trust the tale, not the teller kind of person, I think. And I think there's sort of limits to, Fitzgerald was he racist by our standards? Certainly. That's and again, it's hard for us to get back in that world, or many of us. Fitzgerald's does not have black friends. His wife's a Southerner. There are certain I call it a kind of reflexive racism. It's not a programmatic racism. It's like, it's not Henry Ford's anti-Semitism, which is very programmatic, or Ezra Pound's anti-Semitism, or there's certainly strong anti-black programmatic thinking going on there. He's not part of it. He even makes fun of that. Just goes like Mencken made fun of this kind of stuff. But yeah, in terms of his sort of reflexive attitudes and the language he might use, yes, I think that a lot of people were, and it's very hard for us to imagine ourselves back in a position where it was kind of condoned or okay. And this is where someone like Carl Van Vechten is actually somewhat extraordinary for all his foibles. I mean, he had black friends. They invited them to his house and went out to places with him. This was quite, Fitzgerald hung out with Van Vechten. I'm not sure in that context. But that's quite extraordinary, I think. And some of the people that were connected to the NAACP, and Fitzgerald refers to, I think it's Haywood Brown. He's a Negrophile right now, so it's kind of dismissive. It's not, he didn't have to worry about it. He didn't have to read the Harlem Renaissance writers the way he felt he had to read, some of the other writers coming out of the mainstream literature. So, and it's hard for us to be in that world. But I think, again, his stories, he cannot, help but invoke what this Black presence in a way. Toni Morrison talks about this insofar as he wants to tell this story of America. And I think there's a kind of sympathy again for the outsider associated with that, which is not going to be sufficient for some people. But I think you're right. The villains in his novels are the white plutocrats. It's the same in Tender as the Night. Even in The Last Tycoon, the hero is a Jewish outsider who has made it into Hollywood, and it's the old bosses that are the villains. So he's on the side of a kind of cultural democracy, even though I think he also had tendencies within him the aristocratic values, as they were called, which again he tended to associate with a Southern pedigree, and that's problematic for all kinds of reasons, but that was very much part of the culture, I think. He's growing up in the era of Jim Crow. He's born in 1896, I think it is. And this is when Confederate monuments are being created. And he's growing up with ancestors who were sort of being commemorated in positive ways. So
yeah, he has a number of stories that are about the Civil War and that extol particularly his father's side of the family as Confederate soldiers. When he was very young, he wrote a play called Coward, in which he actually played a Confederate officer when he was a kid.
yeah.
Really interesting point from Stephanie. She says, I've always wondered about the use of the word Holocaust at the very end of chapter 8, followed by the Swastika Holding Company, where Mayor Wolfsheim is working in chapter 9. It's almost like Fitzgerald was predicting things about World War II. What are your feelings about this, or do you think it's just coincidental?
Well, I think if you read the Crisis, for example, the Crisis used the swastika as a symbol, as a decorative device, quite innocently, and I think, as I believe has been pointed out more than once, the swastika did not have the associations, horrific associations it would gather later on. So I think it was just a weird predictive thing that to come out of the book.
Yeah, I know that it was used as a device on the back of Rudyard Kipling's collected works. It was a symbol he'd become fond of in India, and that still kind of jars people when they see it on a bookshelf.
I think Sarah Churchwell has argued in her Careless People that there was also a swastika taxi company that was very popular, well known in 1922, right? So I mean, Holocaust just meant burnt offerings. It certainly could not have meant what has gone on to mean. But I actually, in putting this new edition together, there was a bit of a qualm, because the Fitzgerald was in writing a lot of the Great Gatsby in France, and he was in Rome, I think. And of course, Hitler, the Nazi Party had emerged. I think there's a march in Munich in 1924. So there was an association, but of course, the standard view was that Hitler was a clown. These people were buffoons. This was going nowhere. Hopefully that's sort of similar to what's going on today. We keep saying these people are buffoons, and the next thing you know, they're in power. But I kept that. I think it was Alan Margolis, a Fitzgerald scholar, who made that argument that it could be a connection. But I decided to sort of leave it open, because I'm not sure I want to say, no, he could not possibly have made that connection. Seems to be very unlikely, given how, but again, when we think of the swastika, immediately, of course, we just think of the Nazis, but it is hard to get back into a world where this was a common symbol all over the place. And it was in the Crisis, it's on the taxi company, there's the Rudyard Kipling books, which of course he knew. So it's probably not the case that he was making any kind of connection, but it does seem weirdly prophetic after the fact, given where things went. Yeah.
A question from several people all along the same line about the theory of Gatsby as a Black man passing as a white man. Do you think that this is a possibility, that Gatsby is a man of color in some way? Michael, then Arnold?
Okay. I guess I resist that kind of reading, because all of a sudden, well, here's the key. This is what he really is. And I don't think it's a kind of like the argument that Nick is really gay and has a homosexual attraction to Gatsby. I think this is a way of fixing a text that's not really not wanting us to fix it in that way. I mean, possibilities get opened up, but I don't think so. I mean, the only possible argument for that, it seems to me, is to if Gatsby really did come from the lower swamps of Louisiana, whatever that means. But Gatsby has a pedigree. He has a father named Mr. Gatz. I mean, I think it's more plausible that he might be a Jewish person passing for a Gentile. He did go to a Lutheran college, we're told, in Minnesota. I mean, Mr. Gatz could have changed his name. He sends his son to a Lutheran school, but then Gatsby ends up with Wolfsheim, and we're told Wolfsheim made him. There's a clearly he becomes a kind of father figure. But I think the evidence for Gatsby, again, Gatsby functions like a passing figure. And this is where the connection to Harlem Renaissance writing might be interesting, reading this alongside a Nella Larson novel, for example. But I think the internal textual evidence makes it really impossible to make this kind of argument. But certainly Tom makes the connection. It's Tom that says, I'm not going to let Mr. Nobody from nowhere come, make love to my wife. Or next thing you know, blacks and whites will be intermarrying. So he makes this connection, the association. Or I shouldn't have let him through. Let him. I'm surprised he even got to the back door. So there's an association of he's a class interloper, but the threat represented by him is made a racial threat. But there's no real evidence that he is actually a black character. There's just nothing in there in the novel. So
what Tom says, I think, is you couldn't possibly know Daisy. If you got into a house, it's because you bought groceries to the back door. But the fact is that any delivery person would have had to use the back door back then, and they also would have had low social standing. I don't see anything that tells me that Gatsby is a black man passing for white, but Jewish, yes. But even that, I think, is ultimately refuted because it is more useful in a sense to the entire argument to see J. Gatz as representing the essence of Germanism, of Teutonic, et cetera, that Tom is, and people like Stoddard and others are holding to be, the primary strain of human intelligence and creativity and so on. So, but I think what it does say is that even such a person can be corrupted under the right set of circumstances. And in America, we have nothing but the right set of circumstances for corrupting people. I mean, I think that to me is what Fitzgerald seems to be saying.
Yeah. Yeah, so a nice comment from someone who has mentioned that Gatsby's tanned skin is something that's mentioned. Also, when Jordan says we're all white here, that really kind of stands out in their discussion together. The discussion when Tom mentions Stoddard/Goddard's book. And the fact that he's been depressed by a book, which Nick says is much more surprising than the fact that he has some woman in New York. They had that discussion around the dinner table about the Nordic race and who's an insider, who's an outsider. Of course, they're having this discussion in front of the people who are serving them dinner, whose ethnicity we're not really told about. And that's something I think to consider. An interesting question has just come in about Fitzgerald and his silence, certainly in this book at least, on anti-Irish and anti-Catholic racism, which was such a virulent force in the United States. And our attendee has cited to the hostility generated by the Irish American governor of New York, Al Smith, when he ran for president. Given that Fitzgerald very much self-identified as Irish and was proud of this part of his heritage, would you like to comment on his silence on anti-Irish and anti-Catholic racism? Either of you.
I don't know too much about that, actually. I mean, it might be something interesting to explore, but I think one of the things I've suggested is that, I mean, he very rarely writes about this. But again, when he talks about his Irish background, again, it's usually in the context of a kind of division. I'm sort of half Black Irish and half, I can't remember what that phrase is in a letter, but If he did, feel a certain anxiety or had experienced prejudice because he was an Irish Catholic, I think this would support my argument that he displaces these kinds of feelings of being an outsider or this inferiority complex that he supposedly had. People would sometimes attribute to him onto a kind of identification again with the minstrel figure, this divided figure, and of course. There's a great book on the history of minstrelsy. It's 20 years ago or so, maybe more, about the Irish. It was the Irish that in fact kind of invented minstrelsy. It started in the north before it went south. Eric Lott, that's the guy. It's a great book. It's kind of a classic now, but so I don't know how much he knows about that history. I don't see him talking about his Irish background too much. Myself, but
Princeton washed him clean.
A good old Presbyterian school. Yes, there's that.
We had those Irish intellectuals at the prep school, right? Like Senior Fay and
the Newman
Sean. What's the fellow that wrote about Ireland? One kind of a mentor of his, Sean Leslie.
Yeah.
So they might have given him a kind of pride in this romantic Celticism or whatever. That's a phase that I think he kind of grows up. But he does talk about Dick Diver being Irish, having this Irish side to him. But again, he doesn't make too much about suffering from prejudice or having bad experiences because of that.
An interesting Gatsby question from Philip, who says, Nick demarcates many of the color lines in the novel. At the close of chapter 4, as he and Jordan are leaving Central Park, Nick says, "We passed a barrier of dark trees." The next chapter opens with Gatsby's house ablaze like the World's Fair. Nick seems to be reading and seeing New York society and its spaces politically via color. And he's wondering about any connection between Carraway's very Midwestern take on the racially complex New York he encounters, and how Fitzgerald literally uses words of color to, as kind of an outsider mechanism to trace a line between black and white in the novel. Do you comment on that, Arnold?
To me, Fitzgerald's use of color, whether through the lens of Nick or any, that's the only way it can come, since he tells the story. It's just absolutely transcendently magical, and to me, again, it represents a kind of God presence in the novel. Because the question is, how does this guy with his fairly limited background, from an aesthetic point of view, how does he come up with these fabulous descriptions about stars and this and that and the other and the color of water, and how does he do it? Well, it's because there's some power presiding within the novel that I call a kind of God power, but I can't read it in any way other than the manifestation of Fitzgerald's absolute superiority as a writer, his magic, his genius at work, which sometimes gets out of hand, I think. You think, well, he couldn't possibly really think this and be hustling bonds or whatever in New York. But it's essential to the book. It's essential that there be a higher power in the book, looking down, besides T.J. Eckelberg, looking down on these human beings and the rat race and the race and so on, and that to me exists outside of any plot question of plot and characterization.
Amen. Yeah. Arnold, a question for you is, do you know if Zora Neale Hurston had read Gatsby? One of our attendees wonders about a connection between Gatsby and the opening lines of Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is to say the discussion of the dreams of men versus the dreams of women.
I don't know if she read Gatsby or not. I have no idea. And that opening line, which is sort of puzzling, enigmatic in its own way, I mean, I see this as sort of not quite folk wisdom. I don't mean to say that dismissively, but it is Zora's world. It is Zora's intuition, and I think it stands without the help of Fitzgerald.
All right, no, it certainly does. I think we have time for two more questions. The first one, would either of you care to comment on briefly on the racial issues and racial tension in either Diamond as Big as the Ritz or in a larger text, Tender as the Night?
I pass on that.
Okay, Michael?
I don't know if I can't see much about Diamond as Big as the Ritz, but again, though that is certainly an indictment of the plutocratic class. I actually started thinking about that story more given I'm an outsider, so I see the right getting crazier and crazier in the US. Maybe I'm assuming some of you do too, but what's the end game of that? And I'm struck by Fitzgerald telling a story about someone just simply owning everything. Just like, what if you could just have everything, have all this kind of, but you become a complete sociopath. You're completely locked away from everything. So but I've never thought about a kind of racial aspect to that story. Even though they're clearly white and they're Southern, actually, they are Southerner, and he does actually kidnap some African Americans, and supposedly they can be duped into the idea that the Civil War was won by the South. So yeah, there's probably more to explore in that. Tender as the Night's much more complex. I don't think I can say too much, but it is disturbing in some ways. That does seem to be a story about a great white hero, though he's half Irish, interestingly, and he does again, he's destroyed by the plutocrats. He marries into this plutocratic family, but that his decline is certainly again associated with a kind of rising tide of color, including the tanning of that class. I mean, that's really emphasized early on. And again, I make much. Other people have done this too. There's a dead black man shows up in the middle of that novel, just at the scene where Dick's about to consummate his affair with this young actress, which is really the beginning of the end for him. Well, sort of the second stage of it. And so once again, we've got a kind of expressive, the black is an expressive object, a kind of figure for I don't know what the word might be. Abjection, I guess that's the kind of the term I'm thinking of. But again, where Fitzgerald stands on all of that, because again, certainly the plutocrats, the whites, they come off looking very, very bad in that novel. And this is a story about the decline, the death of America, the decline of the empire. But that's a complex story. It's can't go into that.
And our last question circles back to Gatsby, and it's a big question and a very important one with which to conclude. One of our attendees, who is a teacher, says, and I quote, "This was the first year I had high school students in my English class who refused to read Gatsby past the racist commentary of Wolfsheim, the caricature of wealthy African Americans on the bridge. Indeed, many of our new teachers wish to do away with the novel now. Part of me is in awe of the frankness with which the young are responding. Part of me is heartbroken. Our department did away with Twain and Huck 10 years ago. How do I save Mr. Fitzgerald for 21st century readers?" And Arnold, I'd like to ask you to answer first, then Michael. Thank you.
Well, I mean, I'm just, my heart isn't broken because I'm accustomed to dealing with stupidity as a professor, but not on this level. In the old days, it wasn't this ridiculous. But the idea that you cannot read, or you will not read Gatsby because of certain passages, it's just. I don't know what to say. That's the way we're going. That's the way I guess it's going to be. I did want to say one thing, if I may. I don't know if we have time, and that is that go back to the question of the Irishness of Fitzgerald. I don't know if it's really possible. I'm not Irish myself, but I don't know if it's possible to be Irish of whatever class, upper class, lace curtain Irish, or lower class, whatever, to enter into the world of books and so on, and not have a sense of oneself as a radical in some way, or having a radical vision on politics, culture, the world. And you can strain that in various ways and constrain it and so on. So I think there's a lot to be said for exploring the Irishness of Fitzgerald. But this business of not reading Gatsby, that is so tedious. That is so unbelievably despairing. I don't know. I wish my heart could break, but it's just, it's so icy.
Yeah. Michael?
I agree with that position. I mean, I guess we can be frank. I mean, I had this issue teaching the Scarlet Letter last term that, you know, he didn't say the right things about the indigenous people in the forest or whatever. And I just, you know, these people, this is a different time. They didn't think the exact same way that we did. There's all kinds of interesting things you might find if you actually, you know, like that Chillingworth in the Scarlet Letter actually was working with the indigenous people and actually learned some of his medical tricks from them, you know, whatever. And the same with Gatsby. Take a closer look. Yes, this is a racist, stereotypical portrait. Yes, the Wolfsheim is a disturbing portrait, but so you just be frank about that. This is, but how are they functioning within this larger story? You know, I could tell them a little bit about how Fitzgerald grew beyond this way of thinking, but I'm not sure that's always going to satisfy people. But you know, we don't want to be throwing out the baby with the bathwater. There's lots of offensive things in literature, past and present. Part of the experience of literature is being challenged, being shocked, being bothered, laughing, you know, crying, being disappointed, whatever. But ultimately, it's the whole that matters. So I think this becomes it's a form of lazy reading. It seems to me. It's just, you know, you could zero this, and I don't have to read it, and then they're losing that experience. So it's a great misfortune.
I'm glad they don't have to. Sorry, I'm glad they don't have to read the Bible, because that too will go out the window pretty quickly.
Yes. On that, I think very rousing note, I would like to thank you both so much for being here with us today. Arnold, thank you so much for your time. Michael, thank you for your time, for answering questions, and for your fantastic comments and thoughts. Much appreciated.
Thank you, Anne Margaret, and thank you, Arnold, for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. Yeah.
Yes, thank you all. I hope you all can hear me. I can't figure out how to get my camera back on, but that's no great loss. So I do want to just say the conversation is amazing, and I know we could probably go for another 30 minutes, but I would just like to end on the note saying thank you for mentioning critical race theory, Dr. Rampersad, because I think many of us who are teaching, and especially those of you that are teaching in the high school, are going to face a moment not too far down the line where any African-American literature that you teach, you're going to probably be accused of teaching critical race theory. So I think we need to steel ourselves for that. I saw that a legislator in Idaho came out against To Kill a Mockingbird, which is probably the novel most designed to make white people feel good about race, but it'll never happen here in Alabama because we need those Harper Lee tourist dollars. But I do think we need to have a conversation about how we teach this. And one thing I might suggest about the resistance to reading Gatsby because of those racist passages is to try to make students understand that when they have that resistance, they are in a sense enabling the other forces that are trying to take these books away from them. And, you know, when we look at the histories of book censorship, like The Bluest Eye, again and again, we come to the same issues where, you know, just the fact of certain words, the fact of certain images, the fact of certain attitudes, the very presence in the text is enough to get rid of them. And hopefully we can intellectually challenge our students to say, we don't want to be on that side that is removing ideas from the conversation. So
I also suggest that they look at what character is saying those words, at which character has the opinion of Wolfsheim. Is it narrow-minded Midwestern boy Nick Carraway? Is it bigot Tom Buchanan who's espousing these views? It matters.
Mhm.
Great, great. Well, thank you again. And everybody, I just want to remind you that we will be back on Thursday afternoon with a conversation addressing these same issues in the non-Gatsby works, although we will inevitably make reference to Gatsby. And in particular, we're going to talk about Beautiful and Damned and Tender as the Night. So those of you that were asking those questions about the tan skin, you'll want to tune in Thursday at 1 p.m. Eastern, which is noon Central. And then again, we apologize for our UK and European folks that were keeping you up so late. And I would just like to mention again that if you have not read Professor Rampersad's biographies of Langston Hughes and Ralph Ellison, you are really missing out. They are epic. And I think they are really, really valuable teaching tools in themselves. So all three of you, I can't thank you enough. This has been really a wonderful experience. I thank everybody out there for all the fantastic questions. And we will be processing this video and putting it up on YouTube as soon as I get my yard mowed. So thank you. And we shall see you all again on Thursday.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
See you
Bye-bye,
all.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.